a workshop that Tim Moore gave back in 2018. I worked with Tim on the nitrogen and TDS management processes and the task force. He was there in the very beginning, and as I was. Tim has since retired, and so we thought it'd be appropriate to give you some background, an overview about the Basin Monitoring Program Task Force. And so I thought I'd start even earlier than that, to sort of the pre-task force to the Basin Monitoring Program Task Force. It's called the Nitrogen TDS Task Force. I thought I'd make this a little more interesting for everybody by also giving you an analogy of the process that we went through. And I, with a few pictures and a history of another location that had to deal with a lot of salt, seawater salt. And so I thought this might be a little bit more interest to you as we go through this. Sometimes it can be a bit of a dry topic, and might be a little bit more interesting this way. So, but again, I do want to emphasize, if you go to our website, SAPA website, take a look at Tim Moore's presentation under the Basin Monitoring Program Task Force, and you can see he goes into details a little more technical in nature, and so we can recommend that to you as well. I think most of you know about SAPA, the Santa Ana Watershed Project Authority. We're a joint powers authority, and we have 5 member agencies. Many of them are involved with salt management, water supply, ensuring that we have good quality water for the future. SAPA was formed in the 70s, primarily to address salt management. We were tasked originally as a planning agency. We actually wrote brought on consultants and had staff write a regional plan, primarily focusing on salt management, before the regional board was even formed back in the 70s. And this plan was the basis by which new regional plans across the state were established. A leader at that time was Bill Dendy, who eventually became the state board's executive officer. As mentioned, where SAPA is involved with many different aspects, and in dealing with salt management, one of our first projects was, in fact, the brine line, which is what we call now the Inland Empire brine line. Sometimes you'll see old maps that refer to it as the SARI line, the Santa Ana Regional Interceptor, basically intercepting the salts and getting them out of the watershed to a treatment location down in Orange County and then out into the ocean. SAPA is also a facilitator for many multi-agency task force efforts. I didn't start this process. As task force efforts have been going on for decades. Even prior to my joining on, there was many agencies who got together to assist with updates to the regional board's planning to address salt management and nitrate management. And of course, SAPA's other big activity is long-term regional water planning, which we call One Water, One Watershed. Now, the basis for much of our work for the Nitrogen TDS Task Force was looking at the foundational document, and this is the first regional board plan, the Water Quality Control Plan. This was one version here in 1995, but it was actually established in 1972. At that time, there was a lot going on. EPA was just being formed, and there was a desire to make sure that water quality was not going to get any worse, and we're still continuing to protect beneficial uses. The Basin Plan by the regional board is regulation that specifies water quality objectives for groundwater basins and surface water all throughout the watershed, not just the Santa Ana River. It's critical to protecting the quality of the flows that recharge your groundwater basins. So going back to my analogy here, this castle was originally just a rock by the sea. It is located, and it actually exists alongside France, and it is a granite outcropping, and it is a location that is very unique. And to this day, if you ever go out there, you will see this castle that exists on that granite outcropping, and it's surrounded by the sea. In our watershed, there is a lot of salt that comes into it. We have salt from imported water sources. We have natural salts within the basins. Some have historically always been that way. Salt's been added by agricultural practices, dairy. One time we had the largest concentration of dairy animals in the country in the Chino Basin area. Also, with just industry and commercial and residential use of water, it's always a component of salt being added. So in order to preserve these groundwater basins, the Santa Ana watershed began a process of doing salt management. Looking back at this location, this is called Mount Saint Michel, and it is an amazing location in that it is sometimes when high tide comes in, actually surrounded by salt and salt water. It is an interesting location in that it is still preserved today. Well worth taking a look at one day if you ever get a chance. Back to Santa, yes.
This is Milford. I've been there.
Have you?
It's amazing.
I had a chance to go there about 5 years ago as well, and I was thoroughly impressed as well. And so that's why I thought I'd share
Thank you.
the story behind it. You're welcome. Back to our Santa River watershed. We got to work on building the a pipeline basically taking non-reclaimable flows, mostly high saline water, out of the watershed. The pipeline started in the lower sections of the, pretty much starting at the boundary between Orange County and Riverside, and continuing on up into the Chino Basin. And the first leg of it was really that upper yellow leg that you see extending all the way up to San Bernardino's wastewater treatment plant. And then the lower leg near Temescal desalter and down all the way to Lake Elsinore was constructed later. Again, the big focus was on getting the salt and the brine, high saline brine, out of the watershed and eventually into the ocean. So there's some graphics of our brine line. So salt management, this actually is incorrect date here. It shows over 30 years. Well, we've been around now since the 70s, and so that's closer to 50 years. This is an older slide, but it gives you a sense of the activities. Also, groundwater desalting has increased significantly across the watershed, many new desalters. SAPA was one of the first agencies to actually build the desalter, the Arlington desalter, right behind our headquarters. It was paid for primarily by our SAPA member agencies to ensure that the Santa River wasn't going to be negatively impacted by rising salt water or groundwater that is high saline water coming into the Santa River, and protect that base flow going down to Orange County. So I think with any activity back in 1995, we had to develop a plan and a vision of what we wanted to accomplish. Back in 1995, a group of dischargers came together and said, you know, there's some challenges here with this basin plan. And as they started delving into it and talked to a number of the old, some of the more senior staff who had actually worked on some of that effort, there was a lot of assumptions made. At that time, there wasn't as thorough data that had been compiled, and so the stakeholders, basically the water and wastewater agencies, approached the regional board on doing a basin plan update, and not just similar to what they had done in the past, but something very in-depth to really relook at the groundwater objectives, the boundaries of groundwater management zones, relook at the hydrostratigraphy and how water is flowing, and to really go in depth on this. Likening this to Mount St. Michel, this was the castle that was built upon that granite was really prompted by a vision by a bishop by the name of Bishop Arantius, and he was awakened in the middle of the night 3 times and was told to build this castle. He wasn't too excited about it, but he kept on being awakened, and the Saint Michael was the one who prompted him to do that. And so he got to work to start building a church or an abbey monastery on top of the granite. A long process and many, many decades in the making. 1972, we hear that date thrown around quite a bit to give you a sense of how things have changed. Here's a McDonald's menu from 1972. Compare the prices there of a quarter pounder to what you might have to spend now. We get a good sense of how much things have changed. Anyway, back to their task force. The stakeholders worked with regulators, and this was wastewater dischargers, groundwater management agencies, water masters. Initially, we had the USGS part of this. The task force members actually funded this effort, and the task force was formed. We put together an agreement, and all the parties signed it, basically to implement tasks to achieve their vision, to update the Basin Plan. And the regional board also was a very strong partner in all this, very supportive. All throughout the history of the Nitrogen TDS Task Force, we had the executive administrator, Jerry Thiebaud, sitting at our meetings, monthly meetings, for close to 6 years, which is pretty amazing, that level of commitment and desire to make something a little bit better. Our goal was basically to develop technically sound methods to come up with a new Basin Plan and strive for consensus among all the stakeholders, and something that the regional board would fully support. As we began to scope this, some of the key consultants that helped us were Mark Wildermuth from Wildermuth Environmental. They're part of West Yost. Mark has long since retired, but he was pretty instrumental in getting the scoping accomplished, as well as Tim Moore, who of Risk Sciences, who was a consultant before he retired and helped us put together the scope of work. It was envisioned originally to be about a 3 to 4 year process, but in the end, it took closer to 6 years. Actually, let me see, scoping began in 1995. It wasn't until 2004 that the Basin Plan was adopted, so maybe closer to 9 years. So there was lots of work, and it was, I think, very successful overall, but it took a lot longer than people envisioned. And so, like Mount St. Michel, over 100 years, many of these individuals who were working there in the monastery were basically monks, but also very skilled in various crafts and very knowledgeable about how to build things. One thing they wanted to do, make sure, was to make it very heavily fortified in case they're knowing that they were pretty close to adjoining countries that might want to conquer the granite island. Back to the Nitrogen TDS Task Force, you might see some familiar faces there. The individual sitting back there in the purple shirt is Tim Moore, Risk Sciences. One of the things that he insisted on, and everybody agreed, was let's really look at the terminology in the regional board, but also at the state board, how legal minds might interpret various terminology, things like what is an objective, what is anti-degradation, what is assimilative capacity. Make sure everybody was on the same page in understanding these things. And there was a process that was very inclusive. It's called the Delphi process, where people were given a series of questions. They go back and have to provide their responses to it, but it was all done anonymously, so that people didn't feel like, okay, this is what the region board's saying, or this is what my boss is saying, so therefore I can't really say anything. It was very inclusive in that respect, and was lots of going back and forth to ensure that we could reach a consensus on many of these terms. Very valuable process. In addition to that type of thing, we're evaluating terms. We did a great deal of work, particularly with World Environmental, to calculate the groundwater objectives and update them. As I mentioned, the 1972 Basin Plan objectives had some data, but it was about 2 years worth of data. And some of the assumptions were not scientifically based. Nitrogen TDS task force in the study, we looked at over 1,800 wells and looked at a term, knowing how groundwater flows very slowly, a period of 20 years. And that was the basis by way we look at the ambient water quality updates for the past 20 years. And it's the basis by which we establish our objectives as well for nitrogen and TDS. So this is what the early region board basin plan groundwater objectives look like. And as you look at this, you'll notice that some interesting idiosyncrasies about these groundwater basins, quite a few, and we haven't really changed the number of them too much, but you'll see straight lines in some places, and notice that out in the Paris South and Paris 2, there's like straight lines used. In other locations, you see rather interesting patterns of sort of jagged lines. What these lines represented were these rudimentary models that were used to update the basin plan years ago. There was a model called the Basin Planning Procedures model, and it had basically nodes that were fairly large. And these are actually the model nodes were the basis by which these objectives were established. So it doesn't make a lot of sense hydrologically. So we tasked Wilderness Environmental to go back and do the research, do the in-depth study to reestablish the boundaries of these basins, more based on actual flow, groundwater flow, and the geography of the groundwater basins, impermeable rock and permeable areas, also looking at the various layers and sediment. Many of these basins have multiple layers, and so we wanted to account for that. So here's what they look like today. You'll notice probably the biggest change here is in, of course, the Chino Basin, with more of a north to south flowing into the lower areas, which is the Santa Ana River itself. So you'll see no straight lines here, generally more curvilinear, and these were thoroughly reviewed and reached by consensus to be the groundwater basin boundaries. And this is what the regional board uses today. A part of the nitrogen TDS task force was also to make sure that we are doing an update and gathering data every 3 years for the ambient water quality to see if things were getting better or worse in each of these basins, and basically as sort of an advance notice of where the trends were heading, and not to take immediate regulatory action because we know that groundwater moves fairly slowly through these groundwater basins, but to have a good understanding of where there might be hot spots, problems where things might be getting worse. Overall, you'll see that the green color is generally good and the dark red color is generally bad. It's interesting too, is that a lot of these things have changed as new wells were drilled and more information was gathered. You'll notice along the Orange County area, as they did more seawater intrusion wells, we would collect that data, and then we'd be able to show that actually there were areas that were red, but those were looked at, and it was recognized that that was mostly not because of any deterioration in the groundwater basin, but due to the influence of the seawater, high saline seawater. So This gives you a sense of, and this is a reflection of the latest ambient water quality update that was done from 99 to 2018. Assimilative capacity is also another thing that we want to track. You get a sense of the color code here is the darker green, generally good. You have assimilative capacity, and fading down to a darker orange where you have no assimilative capacity. So this is, again, trends that we're watching to make sure that we're managing the basins. We also track nitrate as nitrogen. And again, you'll see the hot spots, the red spots where nitrogen was increasing. And you can see the influence of the dairy animals and the agricultural practices, particularly in the lower portions of Chino Basin there. There was pretty extensive orchards as well in the Arlington Basin. And then the assimilative capacity, again, for nitrate as nitrogen. So another big part of why it took us more than 3 years to do the work was we had a opportunity that arose as we began to understand the anti-degradation policy under Resolution 6816 by the state, that there was a way in which we could ensure that one can still manage a basin and then as we establish objectives, they could have another objective established that would reflect what we describe as a maximum benefit objective, basically showing and demonstrating by local agencies' actions that they could still protect downstream beneficial uses by a series of monitoring activities, as well as local improvements like desalting and also monitoring and tracking discharges from various treatment plants. One of the first maximum benefit demonstrations was actually conducted by Inland Empire Utilities Agency and the Chino Basin Water Master in partnership, and they had shown that they could do a max benefit demonstration, and now they have ways in which they could still continue to bring in imported water from the state, even though the historical ambient water quality was showing that that might be a challenge. We were able to show that there was a maximum benefit to the people of the state of California, that this could continue as long as these activities, again, of monitoring and primarily desalting were going to take place to protect the downstream beneficial uses. Several agencies propose these, and as they show on the castle there, this is something that the Mount St. Michel endeavored to do, is ensure that it will be well protected as well, that they would surround the church and the monastery with strong walls that, again, to be impregnable from outside raiders. And it actually was, in fact, during the 100 Years' War, England attempted many times to actually take over the island and were unsuccessful due to the immense amount of work that they did to maximize the surrounding walls to the abbey itself. So back to the Santa River watershed, back in 2004, by unanimous vote of the regional board, the nitrogen TDS Basin Plan Amendment was approved without any opposition. Does not say it was easy or not without some challenges. It was not a swift process involving many years, and as you can imagine, over many years, there's oftentimes changes in staff. New people had to be brought on and brought up to speed. Consensus sometimes was not always there. It could be a challenge to overcome, and it took a long time sometimes. But I think with the assistance of having the regional board there, having some really excellent consultant support of Tim Moore, Risk Sciences, it was eventually something that we were able to agree upon and eventually bring to the regional board for approval. the big focus here as we did this process was ensuring that we had good science and not just simply regulatory relief. Though many people thought and hoped that there would be regulatory relief, that was not the end result. They all agreed that they would simply base this on the best science and data available. Looking back at Mount St. Michel, beautiful church, beautiful location, but there was a period of time where there was the French Revolution of France, and everything associated with the church and monasteries and monks was being attacked, and that whole island eventually became a prison, a place where they would bring many of the people who during the French Revolution they wanted to in fact, over 14,000 prisoners actually existed on the island, and the monastery was closed down. So it was a difficult time for that location, in that a lot of the beauty of that existed before had some dark years of history there for a while, until the Reformation occurred after the French Revolution. So going back to the Basin Plan, all the factions within the Basin Plan were represented, upper basin interests as well as the lower basin, wastewater and water supply agencies. We developed, I think, a very strong consensus building process that continues today under a Basin Monitoring Program Task Force. Established ground rules and helped that we had some best experts, and now that we have Tess Dunham helping us from KSC, she is filling Tim Moore's role as a regulatory advisor. We are always mindful that we want to make sure that we're in conformance with the federal and state policies, EPA and the state board, and looking at past legal documents as well. And good to say that the Mount St. Michel was recognized as a World Heritage Site under UNESCO 1979, and right now it's the third most popular regional tourist attraction in France. So if you ever get a chance, highly recommend it. As Ford and I can attest, it's well worth the visit. So that is it on the nitrogen TDS Force. Before I jump into Basin Monitoring Program Task Force, just wanted to see if there's any questions anybody has about that history. I know I shared some of this with the presentation with Tess. She had some suggested slight tweaks on some of the language, particularly on the objectives. Tess, is there anything that you would like to share reflecting some of those comments that you had?
Sure, absolutely, Mark, and thank you. And yeah, I loved your presentation. And as I get to my very small portion towards the end, I will warn people I have nothing near as interesting as Mount St. Michel. So just to warn you in advance. But I just wanted to make sure when we talk about objectives in the context for salt and nitrogen in the Santa Ana Basin Plan, as Mark just talked about, kind of historically, and how they were developed using, the ambient water quality and historical ambient water quality over a 20-year period. And that set the objectives, which are recognized and part of the Basin Plan. But those objectives as set and used in the Santa Ana Basin Plan are a little bit different than what one would consider a water quality objective in the normal sense within the basin planning context and within the water quality standards context. Typically, when we think about water quality objectives, we think of them as set at the level that protects the beneficial use. I think in this context, the most easy example is, I think everybody is familiar that there is a primary maximum contaminant level for nitrate that is set at 10 milligrams per liter as nitrogen. As you may recall from some of the charts and the maps that Mark showed you previously, a lot of the objectives in the Basin Plan for nitrogen in these groundwater basins are well below what would otherwise be allowed and still to protect the drinking water use. That is, again, because they were based on historical water quality and not necessarily how high could you go and still be considered protective of the beneficial use? So there is a distinction. We try to remind people, and there's language in the Basin Plan that talks about them as anti-degradation targets because of how they were set, and that they do serve a different role than traditional water quality objectives, which are what we call use-based objectives. So just wanted to provide that clarification. Because I think it has some bearing, right? Where the max benefit demonstrations under the anti-degradation policy are allowed for many of these basins where we have assimilative capacity, because those objectives are anti-degradation targets. They are not set at the level necessary to protect beneficial uses. But we still, that's then another level of protection that's necessary as well. Just wanted to provide that context.
Great. Thank you, Tess. Appreciate that. Any questions? I see that someone, let's see, can we get a copy of the presentation? Sure. We will certainly get it out to everyone and get it posted on our website as well. Any other questions before I move on? All right, let's jump into the Basin Monitoring Program Task Force. The dawn of a new task force. Mentioned the regional board approved the 2004 amendment and eventually went on to State Board and Office of Administrative Law, and it was approved there as well. As part of that Basin Plan, there was actually language in the Basin Plan that identified the agencies, water and wastewater agencies, were responsible for certain tasks. And so as a group, I think as a group, the agencies felt the task force approach was very workable, and continuing this process where you're not all working separately. The idea was to form a new task force to basically implement these tasks that are defined in the regional board. I'll get into those tasks in just a second here. A task force agreement was together by SAPA with the agency's input. It was eventually signed by all 16 agencies, including the regional board and SAPA. Here's a listing of all those agencies. And you'll notice that there was 4 at the very bottom there that were added after 2015. And these entities either added because they volunteered and felt like salt management was an important part of the process they should be a part of, or they were asked to join as part of their max benefit demonstration and the regulations that they were undergoing. So a lot of activity going on out in the northeast area, in San Gorgonio and Beaumont areas. And so that's why you see those other 3 parties you're joined on. So all these agencies, 20 of them, are now active members and basically fund all the activities of the Basin Monitoring Program Task Force. So what do they do? What is it that everybody had agreed to do as part of the task force agreement? First, they all agreed, and this was defined, that they would be responsible for is conducting this nitrogen TDS update every 3 years to look at the ambient water quality of each of the groundwater basins based on the well data and also the assimilative capacity. Also to conduct a report on the quality of the river. And this was an annual report. And then periodically to do a Santa Ana River waste load allocation to confirm compliance of the river discharges to the groundwater objectives. And we just completed one. In fact, that was part of our Basin Plan, that amendment that was approved by the regional board last year. And then in 2022, it was approved by the State Board and is still going through final review at the Office of Administrative Law. So that was a big activity, and we know and recognize that we need to do this waste oil allocation at a minimum of every 10 years. It could be, it is sometimes need sooner, but it really depends on what people are seeing on trends and growth. Sometimes agencies will do projections, what they anticipate, and that will be in the waste load allocation in their permits. But things change, and the amount of recycling and how that occurs may change. So these are all factors that weigh into whether waste load allocation is updated and conducted again. Our last one was pretty extensive process in that we decided to do an RFP to suggest maybe using some of the more current models, more peer-reviewed models that were out there, particularly with USGS. The one that we eventually came up with was the HSPF model, and it is commonly used for surface water modeling, and geoscience to helped us with putting that together and calibrating the model and comparing it to previous models. It was extensive effort, a lot of time and effort and money, of course, by our member agencies in conducting that work. And soon, about that time, also, State Board passed under the water recycling policy, the requirement that not just our region, but all regions across the state really should have some type of nitrogen and or nutrient and TDS plan. And that was something that is now required up and down the state. Now, we had a big jump on a lot of folks in that we had just completed this big effort and approved it for nitrogen TDS. So we put together, with the assistance of Tim Moore, a declaration of conformance. We were able to submit that to the State Board, which was accepted, and show the state that we met this requirement that they had just established under the State Board's water recycling policy. So many other regions across the state were just beginning. Many of them never got to the level of detail that we did under our nitrogen TDS task force. Many of them don't simply have as many groundwater basins. But I think what we did was viewed as an outstanding example of doing a thorough investigation of ensuring that there are plans to deal with salt and salt management and nutrient management in watersheds. So looking at back since we were formed as a task force, we've gone through 11 annual reports. Actually, more than that, now that I think about it. This is an older slide. This is a slide that actually came from Tim Moore. So that was in 2018. We've done, I guess, 3 more subsequent Santa River water quality reports. Ambient water quality updates, several of those, waste load allocation updates, dozens of NPDES permit renewals. Many times when any agency was considering also max benefit demonstrations, they would come and report those to the Basin Monitoring Program Task Force. So it became sort of a hub by which agencies could share their activities. And it was something I think the regional board felt strongly that it should be shared at this task force. So we were sort of the clearinghouse in some ways of the watershed for many activities that local agencies would embark upon in salt management. We also prevented at the time any new 303D listings in the past, and zero litigation. In fact, I recall Tim Moore stating that one can oftentimes see the benefits of our collaboration or task forces by looking at the agendas of the regional board. The agendas you might see in some of the adjoining cities like San Diego or LA have a long list of closed session litigation matters, not nearly so in their Santa Ana regional board, because we have these collaborative efforts and are seeking to work very closely with the regional board. So I think this is a testament to the feeling and the mission of our regional board. They do want to work with the stakeholders proactively and collaboratively. And I think our task forces are a good opportunity for that interaction to occur. over the past 5 years, as mentioned, June of 2019, we completed waste load allocation. We had to go through CEQA, and under CEQA, there is a process called the supplemental environmental document that had to be prepared. The Basin Plan Amendment was, as mentioned, approved by the Regional Board in December of 2021, State Board in June, and then it is still awaiting approval by the Office of Administrative Law. What's also unique about this last Basin Plan Amendment, it includes provisions to address drought impacts. We have longer-term averaging periods for salinity to reflect changes in the quality of our water supplies due to conservation efforts in response to droughts. And that's now in the Basin Plan Amendment, and something that the Regional Board felt was important as well. And we applaud that cooperation that existed. We work closely also with the Southern California Salinity Coalition for some studies and in a good partnership there. And many of the existing wastewater treatment plants were then reissued permits, and because of the waste load allocation, they could continue to discharge. Tess Dunham, as I mentioned, is now our regulatory advisor and assisting the task force. And one of the things that she has embarked upon has been scoping the planning priorities for the coming 4 years, and even longer than that, I think. For 21-22, the focus of this task force has been ensuring compliance with some updates that occurred by the State Board under the recycled water policy for salt and nutrient management plans. These updates do affect how we conduct our annual water quality report for the Santa River. It affects the ambient water quality update, and we also prompts us to also look at what is causing some of the TDS exceedances in some areas, knowing that there's rising water that occurs in the Santa River. So more investigation needs to occur. And these are things that we agreed we would do as part of the Basin Plan. So we have gone through the process of competitively seeking proposals, and eventually West Yost was selected to do the ambient water quality updates and basically look at ways to improve the process and still comply with the recycled water policy. And this pertains also to our monitoring process under the Santa River Water Quality Report. Those reports, after about 1.5 years of effort, were completed. We have an updated monitoring program for the Santa River, reaches 2, 3, and 4. Also a new work plan for updating the Basin Plan, Salt and Nutrient Management Plan, and that was also completed by West Yost. And both reports were originally released as a draft back in October of last year, and now were formally submitted and completed in March of 2023. So good progress being made there. This was the scope of a new activity that was, as we were going through the Basin Plan Amendment, we agreed that it would make sense to see if we could look at how we're doing our ambient water quality. Is there a more streamlined way, focused way to comply with recycled water policy? And you can see each of the tasks there. We're looking at various new methods to compute ambient water quality in the groundwater management zones. So this is the current scope. This is ongoing, that we, as a Basin Monitoring Program Task Force, have tasked West Yost in collaboration with the task force to undertake. And so that work is underway with the goal to complete it by October this year. In addition, that will also include a plan for compliance all the way out to fiscal year 28-29, so through a completion process of the ambient water quality update. We also have, in parallel, as we discovered and based on some feedback we received from the regional board, to recognize that there are some groundwater management zones that need more data, and we need to resolve those data gaps that exist, to identify and resolve those and create documentation how they would be addressed for the future. So these are the tasks that are currently also tasked to West Yost, working very closely with each of you and how that might occur. We have a number of meetings that will be held to walk through each of the task force agencies and discuss the process for identifying responsible parties. And so you'll see that over the next few months, that process in play. So with that, before I turn the time over to Tess with her final slides, are there any questions about the Basin Monitoring Program Task Force, what we're doing, why we're doing it, or what we've accomplished? All right, hearing none, I'm going to turn the time over to Tess and let her share her final slides here. Just let me know when you want me to advance the slide.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that. And, you know, it's really been a joy to come on and work with the Basin Monitoring Task Force and to, you know, to kind of pick up where Tim and Mark Wildermuth have spent, you know, many years developing the structure and the foundation of the Basin Monitoring Task Force. And using Mark's castle analogy, you know, they built the castle. My role is to try to maintain its integrity for many years to come, and hopefully to not let it become a prison, but to let it continue to be the shining example of salt management throughout California and beyond. And so, and that is a daunting task, let me tell you, coming in new and coming in and trying to continue forward with all the great work that the task force and its member agencies and its, you know, consultants and facilitators have done over the years. So, but, you know, life is not static and the regulatory world is not static. And even though we have, you know, the declaration of conformance with the 2009 recycled water policy, you know, there was a change in the recycled water policy in 2018. It became effective in April of 2019. And that has then caused us to trigger the need for new actions as well. And so I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the planning priorities that we have moving forward, ongoing activities, and you know, why the, you know, if we've been so successful, why does the task force continue? And let's talk about why we still find that there's a need to continue forward and identify some of the challenges that we may face in the future that we hopefully can continue to address in the same collaborative, collective manner that the task force has done over the years. So, of course, we have a new recycled water policy. It does require the regional board to review existing salt and nutrient management plans or nitrogen management plans. Sometimes it's nutrients, sometimes it's nitrogen, by April 8th of 2024. And we are actively working with the Regional Water Quality Control Board staff to conduct that review so they can then evaluate the quality of our TDS and nitrogen management plan that currently exists within the Basin plan in comparison to the revisions to the recycled water policy. And under the policy, this has to be done periodically to make sure that the plan remains consistent with the state's policy in its current configuration. So next slide, please, Mark. So with that kind of background and all of the background that Mark has provided, looking forward, what are our planning priorities? Where do we see ourselves going over the next 5 and 10 years? So first of all, right now we are in the process of preparing clarifying revisions to the Basin plan, in large part based upon the work effort that was undertaken by West Yost in the review of our annual surface water monitoring program for the Santa Ana River. In that review process and in conjunction with the state board's process for compiling the integrated report or identifying impaired water body listings, it became apparent that the Basin plan needs some further clarifications to clearly articulate what was originally intended back in 1995 or 2004 when the Basin plan revisions were put forward to bring in those historical ambient water quality objectives for the groundwater basins. and also for some of the surface water objectives, which are actually designed to protect downstream groundwater basins. So that's ongoing right now, and something that we'll be working on over now and through the summer in order to provide information to the Regional Water Quality Control Board staff with those proposed revisions for them then to take through their formal process between now and hopefully by that April of 2024 timeframe. With that, and in conjunction with that, looking at, what do we need to do to see if the regional board can continue to make a declaration of conformance for our current program as compared to the 2019 recycled water policy. That may include, as part of the clarifying revisions to the Basin Plan, making some adjustments. Again, we're in that process, but the goal is that the plan that currently has been in place and updated periodically as necessary does meet the intent and purposes of the 2019 recycled water policy, just as it did 10 years ago with the 2009 water quality policy. As Mark already indicated, we are addressing data gaps for the groundwater management zones. This is a key priority for regional board staff, that as we evaluate our groundwater management zones, where do we not have data? Where do we have wells that are no longer in existence? So we no longer have data. If we're going to continue to be able to conduct our assessments on either a 3 or a 5 year basis, we need to make sure that we continue to collect ample data and appropriate data to assess the quality of our groundwater. But we also have to identify where we may have some gaps and how do we fill those gaps. And that process is ongoing right now as well. We are looking at starting a new surface water monitoring program. Over the years, some of the monitoring was done by the Regional Water Board staff for Reach 3 of the Santa Ana River, as well as other areas. What we are looking at is actually the Basin Monitoring Task Force taking a more proactive and active role in actual surface water monitoring. We will continue to look to rely on existing surface water monitoring programs, but where there may be a lack of data and information for certain reaches of the Santa Ana River, the task force right now is considering the role that it will play in making sure that monitoring gets done. Much like we do in our other task forces, such as the Lake Elsinore Canyon Lake Task Force, they have a monitoring consultant that collects the monitoring data. That is a new role for the Basin Monitoring Task Force. Won't be near as the level for others, but of course, again, to fill those gaps. So definitely a new role and program for the Basin Monitoring Task Force. Another key priority is with time, we do see that we show a slight increase in TDS in the Santa Ana River Reach 3 that are on the verge of potentially causing exceedances for the TDS objective. We have said for years that we need to do a special study in order to really evaluate what is the cause of that TDS. We have some pretty good ideas. Studies have been done previously, but we need to expand on the studies that were done previously and conduct a special study to better understand the rising groundwater. What are some options maybe to address this so we can make sure that the Santa Ana River Reach 3 meets its water quality objectives, and which is then protective of Orange County's groundwater basins. It's a big component and a priority for the Basin Monitoring Task Force. Another key issue that is arising are, within the Basin Plan, because of the fact that it was created using historical water quality for both surface and groundwater, we have a number of what we call objectives based upon individual salt ions, such as sodium and chloride separately. And those are being applied in the integrated report process as water quality objectives when they were really more of that same anti-degradation target that we talked about previously. And we also know that the regional board has a contract with Squirt, who's doing a study on the salt ions in the Santa Ana River. We're expecting to see that study here this summer and looking to see what it says with respect to potential impacts on aquatic life. So we do anticipate that there will be some potential issues addressing salt ions when, for protecting the groundwater basins, TDS has always been the parameter we've used rather than relying on the individual salt ions. And so there has been some confusion. So that too has been an identified planning priority for the task force for the next 5 years. Next slide. And in addition to all of that, it doesn't stop, right? What do we still continue to do on an ongoing basis? We have our surface water program. We just talked about the fact that the Basin Monitoring Task Force is expanding its role slightly by taking on an actual monitoring program for some sites for the Santa Ana River. We will continue to look to prepare the annual reports through SAPA helps to provide that service to the task force, evaluating what is the water quality in the Santa Ana River for nitrogen and for TDS. We then have our ongoing, we're required by the recycled water policy to reevaluate, kind of ambient groundwater quality on some periodic basis. Previously, over the years, it had been done on a triennial basis or once every 3 years. In the latest Basin Plan amendments and working with the Regional Water Board and based upon consistency with the recycled water policy, that now is going out to approximately at least once every 5 years. Can be done more frequently if necessary, but that 5-year increment we believe is appropriate. Groundwater quality doesn't change quickly. And based upon our numerous ambient water quality reports that we've already done on the triennial basis, it appears that we're not seeing major shifts in a 3-year period. So going to once every 5 years is supportable. But that will be a continued ongoing activity. As Mark mentioned earlier, we have the waste load allocation model. Under the Basin Plan, we're supposed to update that model approximately every 10 years. The waste load allocation model, the final report, was kind of done in 2019, but then there was some additional work that needed to happen. And it was finally completed in June of 2020, which was then relied upon for the Basin Plan amendments that occurred in December of 2021. So that waste load allocation model, we'll be looking to start updating it again soon. It takes a couple of years. It is not a small undertaking, so it's not something that we can wait until 2030, but something that will probably happen around in the 2027, 2028 timeframe to get that started. And then, of course, most importantly, we continue to evaluate data and trends, identifying salinity and nitrogen issues, and really monitor and react to any potential policy change related to TDS and nitrogen, and what that means for the TDS and salinity management policies within the Santa Ana Basin. That could be, for example, the State Water Board's 303D process, or the preparation of the integrated report, which looks to determine if there are water bodies that exceed objectives and are considered impaired. That is currently in process right now for the Santa Ana region, and the Basin Monitoring Task Force did prepare comments on a proposed salinity listing for TDS for Chino Creek Reach 1B, which is one of the tributaries to the Santa Ana River. We will continue to be involved in that process. We always are watching to see what EPA is doing with respect to salinity standards. Could they have a potential impact? We know the State Water Board has an ongoing policy development process for biological objectives and biostimulatory that could have some impacts with respect to salinity and the impact of meeting salinity standards. So constantly, looking to make sure and understand what's going on at a policy level, and doing it in relationship to the science and what we know from all of the years of hard work that this task force has undertaken to really understand the watershed and how to manage salt. So that is where what we've got going on. So just a few minor things, Mark.
Our plate is full for sure. Thank you very much, Tess. Appreciate those remarks. And that is our last slide. Happy to answer any questions on any part of the presentation. Does anybody have?
Hi, this is Patrick from the regional board. I had a question in respect to the surface water monitoring program. You guys mentioned that you were looking to expand that, and I was just kind of curious how you were looking to expand that to what sites and what analytes potentially.
Yeah, Patrick, I don't have it off the top of my head, but in the report that was just submitted in March of 2023 is the proposed surface water monitoring program for regional board staff review. And with that, we did go through, or West Yost, the consulting team, and then of course with review by the task force, went through and evaluated all the current monitoring that currently occurs and identified certain locations where we believe additional monitoring locations should either be added, or if there are those that are not maintaining previous locations. And so I think we're looking at a quarterly monitoring program at the sites that have been identified within that to supplement other monitoring that already occurs. I believe for that, our annual report, we're really looking at TDS and TIN with respect to other constituents. We are looking at doing that in a special study format, which is like for the special study for TDS exceedances versus monitoring used to determine annual compliance with the surface water objectives for TIN and for TDS.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? All right. Very good. Well, with that, thank you everyone for joining with us today. Again, this was just a briefing, a workshop to give you a little history and sort of a status report on and where we're at with it, with the Basin Monitoring Program Task Force. And if you have any questions ever, feel free to reach out to SAPA staff. Rachel Gray is our new department head here at in planning for SAPA, and Ian Acklemore is our project manager representing SAPA on this task force. And of course, Tess continues to be under contract with us, and we're happy to have her on board to assist us. So if any questions arise, feel free to let us know. So with that, I will go ahead and close, and I'll be at the next Basin Monitoring Program Task Force meeting this month, as well as in May, and that will be my last meetings with you. So it's been a pleasure working with you all, and we will see you again soon.
Mark,
Yes.
This is the regional board. I just wanted to take a second to express our appreciation, speaking on behalf of the board members and our staff here in the Santa Ana board, both with your hard work, Tess's, as well as some of the folks who've since retired to get us here, and the leadership that SAPA brings to this watershed is greatly appreciated. So we'll miss you, but we look forward to the future with SAPA, and thank you for the presentation.
You're quite welcome. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for very, very kind words. Appreciate that. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, Mark.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate
Welcome.
it.
Thanks, Mark.
Welcome, Milford.